I've been looking forward to this for a while because Dr. Trevor Tombe's work, professor of economics, by the way, at the University of Calgary, as I said earlier in the show, research fellow at the School of Public Policy. I don't think it's ever been more important to understand what the actual issues are, understand the impact of policy. Well, his work goes a long way of bringing us up to speed in that way. Dr. Tombe, thanks so much for finding time for us.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
I can't even imagine the number when you got that Vanna White Wheel of Fortune, you spin it in the morning and then it hits one of the subjects because, there's just so much going on and so much that impacts us directly. I still find that the challenge, though, and I'm wondering how you feel. For example, you wrote some great pieces on productivity. And thank goodness, in my view, that's becoming a more prominent subject. But I still sort of desperately want to explain, that's important. How would you explain it just to, people listening today just sort of go, hey, why is productivity per capita an important measure?
Yeah. Well, you're right to note that just the pace of change in so many aspects of not just our economy, but
Yeah.
global situation, technological change with artificial intelligence and so on is incredibly rapid, and it's hard to know what to focus on. But over the longer term, I think, at least economically, nothing matters more than productivity growth for the simple reason that that ultimately determines what our living standards are. It ultimately determines how far our paychecks go, what the purchasing power is of the dollars that we earn. Our real income, if you will, as Canadians, is tied to productivity growth. And what we've been seeing over the past several years is a kind of flatlining of that year over year change in what's normally pretty robust growth. If we think about, say, the 20 years prior to 2015, so from 95 to 2015, labor productivity grew at the pace on average of about 1.5% per year, which might not sound like a lot, but that compounds and accumulates to really meaningful improvements in living standards over that span of time. But since 2015, that average annual growth rate has fallen to about 0.2% per year, which is the slowest 8-year period of labor productivity growth that we've seen since the end of the Second World War. And that has real implications for labor compensation, for example, or inflation adjusted real disposable income for Canadian families also growing extremely slow and quite unusually slow, where we just have two historical periods that had slower growth, the Great Depression and the 1990s recession. So we're in a moment now where just the improvements that we as individuals are experiencing in our day-to-day life is comparable to some really difficult periods of recession or depression in the past. And so it's a really unique moment. I think a very concerning one that should receive a lot of attention by not just governments, but businesses and individual Canadians too.
And I'm thinking of one of the consequences of that is, we have a 73-cent dollar, so an American walks across the border and he's got a 40% or she's got a 40% discount if they want to buy a company. And that discount's on labor too. It's, which I think surprises people. I'm thinking the other way when we buy American exports. I don't see how the Canadian dollar has any more strength when you have a productivity differentiation. You have a huge differentiation in what they're spending per worker, in the investment per worker. Like they're at 28,000 and we're at 15,000. How it's sort of like, how can our guys compete is how I put it. And, we've been saying on Money Talks for ages, every weakness in the US dollar, you buy it. Every chance you get a big dip in the stock market, you go and look for opportunities in the States, not in Canada. And I'm afraid that's being reflected in a lot of the stats we see.
Yeah, I think that's right. So productivity and exchange rates are absolutely related. And if you're someone that's producing an item for export in Canada, then there is a benefit to having a lower dollar because it makes the item that you're exporting cheaper from the perspective of a foreign buyer. But critically, and I think something that a lot of people are not really aware of, is that most of our trade, most of our imports are intermediates. We produce items for both domestic consumption, but also for exports using inputs sourced from elsewhere. We have broad global supply chains, and that's often the most efficient way to produce many of the items that we do. But that means that when the dollar is low, that makes your input cost purchases, the input
Yeah.
costs that you buy as a business more expensive. And so there are a lot of subtle implications here, and a low dollar is not something that overall is really a net benefit in aggregate, even to manufacturing. Some win, some lose, but on the whole, we import a lot of inputs, and that low dollar is a problem for firms that do so.
Yeah, what's always worried me about the low dollar sort of argument is, well, if it's so good at 73, what about 30? What about 50? I think then people get an appreciation that isn't good. I mean, their own personal lives. And that's the challenge, to get people to relate these subjects back to themselves so they care about it more. But the challenge I'm finding is, I don't want to talk politics. I don't like it. They insult me on a regular basis. They think I'm an
Mm.
idiot. I mean, I'm just saying, I think it's a disrespectful exchange. And yet I don't know how you can do it without, because we've got a bigger intervention of the government, and there's a distinction between what one party thinks, like conservatives, and, about the size and scope of government and
Mhm.
taxation, et
Mhm.
cetera.
Yeah.
And so how do you handle that? I mean, I'm sure you've written some stuff where you were talking strictly economics, if you know what I mean, or finance. And then, boy, you got lambasted from a political perspective.
Certainly, there's no getting around touching on issues that are relevant for political conversations anytime
Yeah.
you're talking about policy, because at the end of the day, policymakers are elected individuals, and they face a set of incentives, and they also face a set of constraints. In fairness to them, it is hard to communicate in short, bite-sized, snappy,
Mhm.
digestible ways, complicated and often subtle issues. So maybe I'll take a recent example from the federal budget in 2024. We saw an increase in the capital gains inclusion rate, and that has prompted a great deal of debate. And I think that the first thing I wrote on that was noting that what this change does is leads income from capital gains to be treated similarly to dividends, interest, labor income. And overall, I tend to think that a tax system that's neutral with respect to where income comes from is better than one that's not and treats different sources of income differently. But, the counter argument there is that this was a change in the capital gains policy that wasn't tied to other changes. Like when
Yeah.
Mulrooney increased the inclusion rate in the late 1980s, that was done at the same time as dramatic reductions in corporate income tax rates, personal income tax rates, cutting the number of brackets from 10 to 3. So it was part of a broader tax reform. Whereas here, what we did was just change the inclusion rate largely in isolation of other changes. So what it does is lower the incentive to invest. And that's a problem, in that investment is a big source of productivity growth over the past, or since 2000s, over the past quarter century. About 90% of labor productivity growth in Canada is from capital per worker rising. And that requires business investment. So here's a change where you have a pro and a con, and we do need to keep them both in mind. One change makes the tax system more neutral, but it also disincentivizes investment. And then I think the conversation would naturally more productively go to, okay, well, what other changes in the tax code could we do
Mhm.
to improve investment incentives? But that kind of, let's say, nuanced conversation where we recognize pros and cons and we think about trade-offs and alternatives, and that's something that's really difficult politically. And I guess personally, I found that I got a great deal of strong response, and I think thoughtful response, even counter
Yeah.
arguments by many around what I wrote around the capital gains change, because it was just one piece of a much broader
Yeah.
conversation.
And that's obviously a challenge. I mean, my feeling from, having a long, look at my hair, way too long investment background, uh, was that it was part of a bigger picture that I'll just share with you. What I got back was, what, there's more? Are you kidding me? You've just done this and this to me. I thought the rhetoric that the government issued
Yeah.
that under was really deserving of criticism. I mean, it was begging people to criticize entrepreneurs, the Innovation
Yeah.
Society, all the way down the list. And that's I really think that broad context you're saying is one, when they did it before, there was other changes made. There was no appetite. I would go further. It's also within the kinds of changes. I mean, the prime minister starts off his tenure quite a few years ago with accusing anyone who had a small business of being a tax cheat. That doesn't set the right now, that's not anything that you can deal with. I mean, other than you could acknowledge it maybe, but I mean, that's not
Yeah.
research. That's not what you're looking at when you examine that. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I'm obviously very sensitive to the investment part, but also back to your productivity point, is you look at capital investment per worker. Oh my gosh, it's not even close. Well, nothing in that standalone encouraged capital investment, which I think, I don't know about you, but I couldn't remember the Bank of Canada ever doing what Ms. Rogers did. It says, if this was a glass, I'd break it and it would be an emergency, which
That's right.
I was sure was music to your ears, given you had been pushed, like really talking about that as a serious issue. But at the same time, the rhetoric that came around that, I think, is really the problem.
Yeah.
There wasn't a broader, they didn't even present a case other than, oh, those rich people don't pay. And
Yeah.
I don't think personally that stands up to any scrutiny when you look at, StatsCan numbers. So,
That's right.
yeah,
No, I couldn't agree with you more there. And you're right to note it's not really about technical, economic, analytical issues, but that kind of rhetoric is quite divisive.
mm-hmm.
That's quite clear, and it does distract from actually a real policy conversation. If there are concerns around inequality, fair enough, we can talk about those.
Yeah,
What is that distribution? How has it changed? What are the tools available to make adjustments there? And usually that then is a conversation around what should personal income tax rates be, and so on. But that was certainly not how it was framed. And
presented.
I think
Yeah,
we're long overdue in Canada, in my personal opinion, for a harder, broader look at the tax system. Tax reforms are available that could dramatically boost investment incentives, and we should think about having a more neutral, technical lens to look at that. Maybe something along the lines of, again, going back to, I think it was Trudeau Sr. created a Royal Commission, the MacDonald Commission, that reported to Mulroney, and this motivated a lot of really productive changes that crossed party lines at the time to really improve the overall economic and business environment in Canada. And I think we're due for something like that again, especially given kind of the global context of rising uncertainty that we're in right now. We really need to make sure that we're getting our own domestic policies right, in the face of that uncertainty.
what worries me is, and I've been saying this, and again, I'm absolutely nothing I say you have to agree with, but I'm saying that it's clearly the economics has not been, or finance has not been the priority for this government. That's one of the political choices. I mean, they have things like, I suspect if people have climate change as top of their agenda, they're not voting conservative. And if economics are, and these kind of issues are theirs, you're probably going to go a different direction in the current government. It hasn't been a priority. So I'm kind of sitting there and I'm watching more and more people with a strong economic and financial background kind of weighing in, and they're worried. The productivity number you started with is one of the things that jumps out at me, lack of capital investment. But back to your point about a broader conversation is, maybe with a lot more expertise applied to it. But start with the goal. What are we trying to do with our tax system? And unfortunately, the words, as I said, came out of the mouth of the finance minister. We're trying to punish the actual people who've done well. No, that's not going to work. But there are, just to make people aware of it, because they're not hearing about it. But there are ways to tax that don't have the significant economic incentive impact, if you know what I mean. There's better ways to tax than others if you're worried about economic growth. I should have said, although verbosely I took 20 minutes when I should have done it in one.
No, that is a critical point, that there are better and worse ways to tax in terms of creating incentives for business investment. So we can view tax reform as separate from conversations around what's the appropriate size of government, for example. Whatever amount of revenue you want to raise, there are more efficient ways and less efficient ways of doing so. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that generally speaking, the GST and broad-based consumption taxes tend to be more efficient economically than taxes on corporate and personal income. And there's political challenges there for sure, but there are still ways within the income tax system to improve their efficiency. One of the I guess lowest hanging pieces of fruit to improve income taxation would be to have full expensing, for example, of investment within the corporate income tax system. Treat a dollar spent on investment the same as we treat a dollar spent on operating expenses of a firm. Whereas right now, that's not the case. A dollar spent on longer lived capital items is gradually expensed over time. And that has the effect of delaying the tax savings you get
Mhm.
from it, which lowers its value. So just dramatically accelerating, allowing for 100% expensing right up front of any dollar spent on investment. That would be a way to dramatically, effectively lower taxes on investment, even without changing the statutory 15% federal corporate tax rate that we have. And within the personal income tax system, having much more scope for savings in a way that allows people to deduct from their
Mhm.
income subject to personal income taxes. So expanding RSP room, expanding TFSA room, expanding, maybe creating other vehicles to improve the ability of individuals to save. And effectively what that does is it makes the income tax system more like a consumption tax if you're allowing
Yeah.
for any savings that you make to be deducted from your income for tax purposes. So there's absolutely a long list, and we could go on and
Yeah.
on. But I think having that conversation and being willing to make big changes to the tax system to improve its efficiency is, as I said before, long overdue. And the benefits, especially in light of low investment, low productivity right now, I think critically important.
Um, I'm going to switch a little bit because you wrote about the TMX, the pipeline coming on
That's
stream this
right.
past week, and and again, you were very clear. You said I'm not talking about that it was supposed to be 5 billion or 7 billion or nine
That's right.
billion, and it's 34 billion. And so that you preface what you were saying. I love one of the comments though that I think people will recognize, but maybe not apply it as well as often as they should. As you said, a dollar tomorrow is worth less than a dollar today. Each year discounts the value of money,
Mm-hmm.
and you use the number of 8%. I'm just saying, I think that's incredibly important for people to understand because obviously cost of living still ranks as a top concern for people. And they express it like, and I mean, I've done lots of numbers on it. And back to the capital gains, by the way, I said, if you inflation adjusted the capital gains, I'd have a
Yes.
lot more fun
Yes.
with that. I
Yes.
was talking
Indeed.
about, I look at StatCan inflation calculator, and it was like a $400,000, I chose house, $400,000 expenditure was 825 today.
Yeah.
And you're not ahead. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you're taxing without inflation adjustment, you actually are
100%.
losing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that. 'Cause that's a great example of one change that can improve investment incentives. So the inclusion
Hmm.
rate's one thing, and a lot of counter arguments to those um, against the change noted that you often have to wait a long time in order to realize those capital
Yeah.
gains, and especially given inflation, that's a problem because it might look like you have gains, but in any real sense, you don't. And we inflation index many other aspects of the tax
Hmm.
code, and we could absolutely index capital gains, and I think we should for a lot of reasons. I'm glad you noted that.
Yeah, but positive economic reasons and fairness reasons. Well, they're the ones who are lecturing me on fairness every afternoon, and I just wait for their latest pronouncement because I can't think for myself. But for what's fair, sorry, pardon me for that. But just in a nutshell, just very
Mhm.
quickly on the TMX opening
Right.
up. I mean, one of the things that we're not talking about the over budget and why that happened. We're talking about we got a pipeline today that. I think is going to shrink the differential between, Canada
Mhm.
Select and what we're getting. It's been a long time coming, but my goodness, it's yeah, I love the work you did. I hadn't seen anybody else talk about this. That it's actually okay. Let's forget all that stuff. Just what if we owned it today? Is it a ongoing concern? Sort of. Are we making
This,
money here?
this piece I wrote for the Hub, I guess, about 2 weeks ago. So it was released on April 30th over at the Hub, and it looks at the benefit side of the
Hmm.
pipeline. So again, just to reiterate right off the top, I'm not writing an apology here for the cost overruns, and there's some
Yeah.
big, important open questions, and no doubt lessons learned, and
Yeah.
stuff on that side of the ledger. But let's just think about the benefits of the pipeline. How large are they? Like, should we have in mind that a future buyer of the pipeline, which hopefully we're able to arrange soon, has to shell out $34 billion in order for taxpayers to be made whole? So I wanted to point out that no, that's not the case. We don't need a buyer to actually pay $34 billion. What we did to finance the construction costs through the Trans Mountain Corporation there was to use debt, about $27 billion in order to cover those costs. And a future buyer would pay the government, but
Mhm.
also take on the debt associated with that project. And the willingness to take on that debt is really largely because this pipeline generates revenues that are quite a bit larger than not only its operating costs, but also interest and debt repayments that are scheduled to occur. And so it's a very profitable asset. So just for some perspective here, we have in the first full year of operations of the pipeline, it looks like it might generate about $3 billion in revenue. And that compares to only about $500 million in operating costs. And so you add in, that gives room then for interest payments on the, yes, large debt load that it has. And gradually over time, we start repaying that debt pretty rapidly. And the pipeline's profit, its net income, just grows and grows and grows in future years. And if you look over the next 20 years, and try to ask, well, what's the present value of that
Hmm.
stream of cash flow that we're getting after all the expenses, all the interest payments, all the debt repayments, and later all the taxes, because it'll pay corporate income taxes on its profit later on. We get a present value of between 4.2 to 8.6 billion, depending on the scenario.
Yeah.
And that actually means there's a lot of scenarios where a private buyer might be willing to pay more than the 4.5 billion that taxpayers put into it. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty there. We'll see
Yeah.
how the details shake out. But just as an individual asset, it's profitable even despite the cost to build. But much more importantly is the implications for Canada's economy. This is a piece of infrastructure that is critical for the most important export item that Canada has to offer. And that's, in this case, oil. And it makes it lower cost for producers to ship out. And that means the gap between prices received by producers here versus world prices abroad will shrink. How much it will shrink is an open question, and estimates vary, but the Canada Energy Regulator's estimate on this was maybe about $9 per barrel that
Yeah.
differential will shrink by. And that's enormous. We produce millions of barrels every day. And so if each one of them is now $9 more in terms of what's received as revenue, that benefits producers. It also benefits governments through royalties. It benefits the economy as a whole in almost every single province. Estimates there vary, but the Bank of Canada most recently noted that just this pipeline coming on the scene in the second quarter of this year, we'd see national growth rates bump up by a quarter of a point. And that might sound small, but
Yes.
0.25% of a $3 trillion economy. And we're talking about $7 billion a year in boosted annual income. And that's slightly lower than the longer term effect that the Canada Energy Regulator presumes might be the case, between 0.3 to 0.4% boost on growth, which again means that annually we're receiving considerably more in income in, again, every province of Canada, with only the exception of New Brunswick and potentially PEI. So Ontario, Quebec, BC, and of course Alberta benefit from this type of infrastructure. And the present value of these gains, if we look out to 2040, bring that to the present using the Canada Energy Regulator numbers, we're talking about a potential economic boost to the overall economy of Canada by something on the order of $240 billion.
Yeah.
So the benefits vastly outweigh the costs of building this piece of infrastructure. And I think that's critical to keep in mind, because while many might view it as a boondoggle, and there might be a lot of issues behind why it saw costs rise as much as it has, the benefits are still enormous in comparison.
Let me just, forgive me. I want to shift gears, borrow a little bit of that, and our time's short here. But you are, I think, the leader in writing about the danger of provincial debt. There's a lot of talk about the deficit, and I might say, just I've been critical of the talk about the federal debt is sustainable. I said I don't think that's the question. The question is, what are the implications? What are the
Exactly.
consequences of
Right.
that? I mean, yeah, of course, my point is, of course, it's sustainable. You can print the damn money if you need to. You can get the Bank of Canada to help and all of that stuff. I'm leaving that. But the provincial debt rarely gets the focus. And I'm sitting, a lot of our audience out in BC, out in Alberta, in Ontario too. But I look at that BC situation that you've chronicled, and
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
got the numbers from you. I knew what was going on. I was still shocked, at the amount of debt buildup. I think just aren't aware of it at the provincial level.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to note here because when we're talking about public finances and public debt and the long-term future, yeah, the big challenges are provincial, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Yes, we're running a meaningful size deficit federally, and there's pros and cons of that, and one could view that as imprudent. But to your point, it's a really difficult case to say that the federal debt is not sustainable in a technical sense.
Yeah.
But provincial debt, this is one largely because of aging populations and healthcare being a provincial responsibility. It's really hard to avoid the conclusion that any analyst that sits down and thinks about where we're headed provincially finds that revenues grow provincially more slowly than spending because of aging. Healthcare pressures from aging, that's obvious. But also as labor force participation rates decline, as more and more
Mm-hmm.
people retire. Naturally, that has implications for income tax revenue, for example, and rates of economic growth. So we're going to have slowing pace of revenue growth, rising pace of expenditure growth for many, many years. And when you project out how fast provincial debt levels will then grow as a consequence, systematically find that it grows more quickly than the economy, which is not sustainable. What we need is debt to not grow more quickly than the
Yeah.
economy.
Well,
And, and
yeah.
and some provinces are in a worse situation than others. And BC is an interesting one where we've seen a pretty big shift in even just the short term trajectory of BC debt. Put aside the long term issues resulting from aging populations and healthcare, we see provincially that spending levels have grown dramatically in recent years, not just operating spending, but even capital spending. And what we're seeing
Mm-hmm.
as a consequence is debt levels that are growing much faster than the economy. Debt in 2023, for example, in BC, about 18% of GDP. And that's higher than where BC was in 2017, 2018, when there was a change in government, pretty similar to where BC was in 2013. So 18% is not too much of a departure from past levels, but the government's own projections in its budget from earlier this year finds that it's going to reach 28% by 2026. So in
Yeah.
the span of 2 years from now, we're going to see debt levels in BC rise by the equivalent of 10 full percentage points of GDP. That's a rapid change. That's a larger change in provincial debt than what we saw during COVID, which was an increase from 15 to 19%. So a really big change in the short term for indeed what is one of the richest provinces in Canada. And I think this is something that, especially when you think about the longer term pressures that provinces face, something that's really kicking the fiscal can down the road in a way that's going to make solving the longer term challenges more difficult. So I think it's a pretty risky move.
Well, and again, you look at other, the thing that worries me when I see deficit projections or comments on it, I need to know what the variables are or what the assumptions are. And I still think we're in a credit situation. I've always said that, we're going to solve this sovereign debt crisis in the credit markets. It's not going to be in the economy. I mean, it's the credit markets that are going to respond, as we've seen in about 150 countries so far.
Yeah.
You
Or
know,
what
and,
we saw in the 1990s in Canada.
yeah, I mean, it's a serious issue on that basis. And again, I don't see near enough interest in having a proper debate. I mean, I think people, when they hear the stat that you just alluded to, for example, out in British Columbia, they're going to be shocked. That really that fast. And it all has implications, and that's why I encourage people to go to follow you on Twitter, which we'll put up on all our notes here. Follow you on the Hub, which I really enjoy, as I say, a chance to get some clear-headed, analysis of these issues. And so I think you're doing great work. Keep it up. And really, Trevor, please know how much we appreciate you took time today.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that a lot. It was great to talk with you today as well.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on.